everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the concept of hoisting in JavaScript. You know, what it actually means and how functions and variables get hoisted. So hoisting is sort of the concept in JavaScript that allows us access to variables and functions earlier, variables and functions in our program within a scope earlier before they are declared, right? So you don't get an error message if you try to access a variable or a function before the line where that variable or that function was declared. And well, variables declared with let or const still get hoisted, but if you try to access them earlier in the program, you'd get an error message. But we're going to look at all of this today. So let's get to it. So for example, here we have var x is equal to 1, right? If I log x down here, say console log x, we get 1, right? Now if I move this console log statement up here, what do you think we'll get? We get undefined. Why? Now, I have a video where I explained how the JavaScript engine executes our code, how it executes our program, and I will talk a bit, or I'll explain a bit about that today, but we'll be more focused on the part where hoisting occurs and how hoisting occurs during that process. So now we're trying to access this variable x, right, before this line where it was declared, and we're getting undefined. If we declare a variable y with the let keyword, let y, and we set it equal to 2, right? And then we log y above here. What do you think we'll get? We're getting a reference error saying y is not defined. Why, right? When we logged x above here, we got undefined. But why are we getting not defined here? We'll see why in a minute. But now if we change let here to const, we still get the same reference error, right? Because when it comes to hoisting, variables declared with let and const behave the same way. But in this video, we're going to be using let because it's shorter to type. Now, before I start explaining why we're getting different values when we log both variables, or why we're not even getting an error message here for x that was defined with the var keyword, let's see how functions behave. So if we have a function here called say hello, right, that actually does what its name says, it prints hello, console log hello, right? Now if we call say hello down here, say hello, hello gets printed to the console, right? Now what if we call say hello up here? Move this, call say hello up here before this line where the function was declared, right? Hello gets printed. How are we able to access this function at this point, right? Before the line where the function was declared. Hoisting is what allows us access this function from up here before the line where the function was declared. Now I'm going to use these slides to explain the concept of hoisting, right? Now, as I explained in the previous video on how JavaScript executes our program, when this program runs, an execution context will be created. A brand new execution context will be created and added to the call stack here. That execution context is called the global execution context. Now, code execution in an execution context happens in two phases. We have the memory allocation phase and the code execution phase. The first phase is the memory allocation phase, and this is where hoisting takes place. So please pay attention because we're going to go through this program now line by line. Now, we're in the memory allocation or the memory creation phase. What happens here is all the variables and functions declared in this program within this scope, we're currently in the global scope, will get allocated a space in memory, right? Now the variables, just the variables will be allocated a space in memory. That's the declarations will be assigned a space in memory, not the assignments. These variables will be assigned their values during the code execution phase. So on the first line, we have var x is equal to 1. Now x will be assigned a space in memory, and because it was declared with the var keyword, it will be initialized to undefined. So variables declared with the var keyword gets initialized to undefined during the memory creation phase. Remember, I said during the memory creation phase, these variables don't get assigned their values. They're just for this x now that was declared with var, it will be initialized with undefined for the time being during the memory creation phase. On the next line here, we have let y equal to 2, right? This variable was declared with the let keyword. Well, the variable gets assigned a space in memory, but it doesn't get assigned any value until the code execution phase, right? So variables declared with let and const also get hoisted. They get allocated spaces in memory during the memory creation phase, but they don't get initialized with any value, not even undefined, until the code execution phase. Now on the next line, we have a function called say hello. When this function gets assigned a space in memory, it's added with this entire function body. This entire block will be allocated a space in memory with this identifier here called say hello, right? So the entire function body will be assigned to the identifier. The entire function will be allocated a space in memory. So say hello is a function declaration. For function declarations, not function expressions. We'll get to function expressions later. Function declarations get assigned a space in memory and initialized to their function value, the entire function body. Now the memory creation phase is done, right? There's nothing else to be added to memory. JavaScript now moves to the code execution phase. And in this code execution phase, these variables, the identifiers that were added to memory, they get initialized with their values. They get initialized with the values you declared them with, right? Now we haven't started the code execution phase, right? So the identifier x here hasn't been initialized with its value. It still has undefined. So if we try to access x from the top here, imagine that here we have a console log statement that says console log x on the first line here, and the JavaScript engine is ready to enter the code execution phase. So the first thing here, right here, is console log x. What does it do? It checks the memory or the variable, the memory creation, the memory, this space where we're declaring the variable is also called the variable environment. So it checks the variable environment to see if there's an identifier there called x. And yes, it finds it. What value does x hold? X holds undefined. That is why here, when we try to access this variable x defined with the var keyword, before its declaration at this point, we get undefined. And that's how hoisting works, right? Now for this variable declared with let, right, if we try to log it at the top here, we get a reference error, right, saying y is not defined, because variables declared with let and const, they don't get initialized. See, this variable here is not initialized with any value during the memory creation phase. So when JavaScript tries to access the variable, it checks the variable environment and it doesn't find any value, so it returns an error. Meanwhile, technically, during the memory creation phase, variables declared with let and const are set to be in a temporal dead zone up until they get initialized with their values during the code execution phase, right? So this variable is in what's called a temporal dead zone, right? Up until this line where it's declared, it's hoisted, but it doesn't hold any value, so we don't have access to it before this line. That's why we get an error saying y is not defined, right? But remember, when we call this function up here, when we call this function, it printed hello to the console. I guess you know why that happened. Now back to our slides. During the memory creation phase, when the JavaScript engine was allocating memory, right, it added the entire function body, the identifier say hello, and its function value. It added the entire thing to this variable environment. So up here, when we called say hello, the JavaScript engine checks the variable environment. It sees that say hello is a function, right? And the entire function body is present. So it just executes the function and prints hello to the console, right? So let's complete the code execution phase for this program, right? On the first line here, we have var x is equal to 1, and this is the code execution phase. So it assigns 1 to x. And then if we try to access x below this line where it was declared, 1 gets printed, right? But if we try to access x above this line, it still holds undefined in the variable environment. That's why we get undefined. On the next line, we have a function declaration, right? Now the JavaScript engine or the thread of execution will not enter that function body. It will not enter the code. It will not enter this function body here, right? Because the function has not been called. The function has not been invoked. So it moves to the next line. On the next line, we're calling the function. We're invoking the function. So it creates a brand new execution context and adds it to the call stack, and then it prints hello to the console. Now this right here is a function declaration, right? So function declarations hoist, function declarations get hoisted, but function expressions do not hoist. You can't call, or you can't use a function expression before it is declared. A function expression is a function that is assigned to a variable, right? Now this is a function declaration, and this var greet, right? This is a function expression, and it can be named or anonymous. So when you have a function expression, the variable name, that is this identifier greet here, will get hoisted. Greet will get assigned a space in memory, but the function assigned to greet will not. The function assigned to greet will not get hoisted. So if this was part of our program during the memory creation phase, when the JavaScript engine here sees the variable, this variable declaration var greet, it takes greet, assigns it a space in memory, and initializes it to undefined because it was declared with the var keyword. Right? So this function say hello, the function assigned to greet, will only be assigned to the greet variable during the code execution phase, right? But for now, just the variable greet will get hoisted. So if we try to call greet up here, let me move this, greet, we get a type error saying greet is not a function. And that's because we're calling greet up here, right? It hasn't been assigned its value, which is a function. We know it's a function, but at this point JavaScript doesn't know that. If we try to log the value greet holds, console log greet, we get undefined, right? Because that's the value it currently holds in memory. During the code execution phase, it has not reached the line where greet was declared, right? So the variable greet at this point has not been initialized with its value, which is a function. Currently, it still holds undefined, and that's why we're getting undefined. So when we call greet here, we're actually calling undefined, and undefined is not a function. That's why we get a type error saying greet is not a function, right? If we declared this function expression with the let keyword, when it gets hoisted, that's when it gets assigned a space in memory, right? It won't get initialized with a value because variables declared with the let keyword do not get initialized with a value during the memory creation phase. So let me just change var here to let, right? See, we get greet is not defined because at this point greet doesn't hold any value in memory. We've not gotten to the line where greet was defined and it was declared with the let keyword. So currently it doesn't hold any value in memory. It's still in the temporal dead zone. And that's the end of this video. We have come to the end of this video. We've seen that hoisting allows us access variables and functions earlier in a scope before they are declared. And if a variable is declared with let or const, you can't access that variable before its declaration. And lastly, function expressions don't get hoisted, right? The declaration gets hoisted, but they don't get assigned their values until the code execution phase. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.